All right, we're going to get started. And I'm going to keep opening preambles to a minimum. I'd like to welcome everyone to this event, Contesting Hate, a Critical Response to Christchurch. We're going to begin with some brief remarks from Dean Danny Macintosh of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. Just a brief word on the format of this event today, so you guys have a heads up. We are going to be having opening statements of about 5 minutes each from all of these panelists. And we're going to try to be pretty tight with the time in order to preserve the last half of this hour, these 2 hours for Q&A. So, and our moderator is Lisa Conant, who is chair and professor of political science. And she'll be keeping us in line. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dean Danny Macintosh.
Hi, I'm Danny Macintosh. I'm the Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, and I'm thrilled to have you all here today, thrilled to have our very esteemed panel here, and happy to be sponsoring this in collaboration with the Center on American Politics, Phi Beta Kappa, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the Joseph Corbell School, Department of History, Center for Judaic Studies, and I think I probably missed some folks. What is wonderful about this is that it demonstrates the power and the opportunity for experts from across multiple areas, from our interdisciplinary centers, to work together on what is a critical issue of our time and that we want to be engaged with as academics interested in the public good. Thank you, Chad Leahy, Assistant Professor of Spanish, for organizing this and putting this together. This was an enormous effort and critically important, and your energy has been critical in doing this. Thank you. We're coming together today in solidarity and also with the motivation to do better and to be better and to reject hate and to choose respect. On March 15th, 2019, 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand were attacked during Friday prayers. According to reports, 51 people were killed, 41 more were injured. 1 month later, 258 people were killed and more than 500 injured on Easter Sunday attacks coordinated against targeting Christians in Sri Lanka. The same month, the shooting at a synagogue in California on the last day of Passover left more victims. 6 months after, a synagogue in Pittsburgh was attacked, leaving 11 dead and 7 injured. As all of us are aware, these are neither the first, nor do we expect them to be the last incidents of hate leading to attacks and murder on people simply because of who they are. And going through the litany that quickly sometimes makes us think it just keeps happening. There's nothing we can do, and it just keeps happening. And I congratulate and honor my colleagues here for saying, as academics, we don't just try to understand, we want to see what we can do, and we want to contest the hate, and that's what this is about. In thinking about the impact, it's not just numbers, these are individuals' lives who were snuffed out, individuals who are making contributions not only to their families, but to their communities, and the potential for their contributions has been lost. And I'd like to take a moment of silence now to think about them, to honor those who have been murdered in hate around the world for whatever reason, whether it be their race or their faith, or their language, or their sexuality, or their political beliefs or ethnic identity. Let's pause for a moment and think about them. These acts of violence raise the question, what can we as scholars and teachers do in response to hatred and violence in the world? No matter whether their academic focus is in the past or the present, we live in the present and want to act in the present. Today is about exchanging ideas, talking and listening to one another, and sparking action among ourselves and within our communities. As we're a university dedicated to the public good and committed to the value of inclusive excellence, we have an ethical imperative to engage and confront challenges such as this. And again, I honor my colleagues for doing this and appreciate all of you for coming to participate in this conversation. I look forward to this. Thank you very much for coming and for your work.
So I will be really briefly introducing everyone, and this is the system I'm going to use to keep you in line. A yellow card means that you have 1 more minute. A red card means please finish your sentence. And if you don't pay attention to this one, you're going to get some music. So you can read the bios on the slides rather than me saying this to save time for you to ask questions and make comments. So first we have, I guess, yes, me moderating, and Professor Hashemi.
Well, what a perfect day to organize an event, the day that Donald Trump is in Colorado, literally 45 minutes down the road. So as scholars, teachers, and public intellectuals, how should we respond to the challenge of hate? What can we do, what should we do from our particular disciplinary, institutional, and personal positions to make a difference? In thinking about this question, I was reminded of a very influential essay I read as an undergraduate student. In 1967, Noam Chomsky published an essay in the New York Review of Books on the responsibility of intellectuals. He was responding to the great political and moral challenge of that era, the Vietnam War. He argued that intellectuals had a unique ethical responsibility to, quote, speak the truth and to expose lies. Intellectuals are in a position to expose the lies of government, he argued, to analyze actions according to their causes and motives and often hidden intentions. In the Western world, at least they have the power that comes from political liberty, from access to information and freedom of expression. For a privileged minority, Western democracy provides the leisure, the facilities, and the training to seek the truth, lying behind the veil of distortion and misrepresentation, ideology and class interest, through which events of current history are presented to us. Thus, the responsibility of intellectuals is much greater than the responsibility of the average citizen because of the unique privileges that intellectuals enjoy in the academy. But of course, there's an assumption embedded in these remarks that speaking the truth and exposing lies has a transformative political capacity on a wide level. What do you do in a political context where roughly 40% of the population doesn't care about the truth and are willing to accept lies as the truth because doing so can make America great again? We're clearly operating in a different and radically different political landscape. How we got here and how we might be able to alter the trajectory that we are on are questions that academics and as scholars and intellectuals we have a responsibility to answer. I think one response to the rising tide of hate in the United States and around the world is to rethink our research agendas, the courses that we offer and the projects that we choose to pursue. I think the work of C. Wright Mills is instructive here. He was an American sociologist and a professor at Columbia University. Mill was concerned with the responsibility of intellectuals in post-World War II society and advocated public and political engagement over uninterested observation. And his writings had a significant effect on New Left movements and social organizing during the 1960s, especially with respect to the Civil Rights Movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement. And Mills was very critical of the dominant modes of social inquiry that had come to dominate post-war American social sciences. He called for the focus on research projects that had a compelling sort of moral impetus behind them because they illuminated contemporary moral and political questions. And he encouraged his students and he encouraged other scholars not to pursue research projects that simply tried to make the status quo more efficient, but that really tried to illuminate the human condition in some relevant way. And so I think this is a moral obligation that I think is incumbent upon academics now, given the huge stakes that are involved, to rethink our research agendas, the courses that we teach, the projects that we pursue. Unless they are directed in this particular capacity, trying to solve this huge political and ethical crisis that consumes us, then I think we have failed as academics. So just to cite one example of the type of research that we are talking about, that I'm talking about, question, does Donald Trump's political rhetoric have a measurable link to reported hate crime and extremist activity? we would think that's the case. It just so happened that a bunch of scholars earlier this year researched the topic using serious social science research, and they found a direct correlation between the counties that hosted one of Trump's 275 presidential rallies and the rise of hate crimes in the subsequent months. And in fact, what they found, to make a long story short, was that if a county held in 2016 a Donald Trump rally, there was a 226% increase in the rise of hate crimes in that particular vicinity. Now, I've got a link here that should pop up, but if you just look at the summary of the study, which was published in the Washington Post, it gives you a sense of the type of research that has moral meaning and that helps illuminate the particular moral crisis that we're facing at this moment. My time is up. Thank you very much.
Fantastic first example on timing. Professor Stanton.
So I'm going to say some of what Nader said, but on a smaller scale. I work in Islamic studies, mostly on the Middle East and secondarily on the United States. And so Nader and I both, I think, hear and see a lot of interesting views on Islam and Muslims, mostly from non-Muslims, but also sometimes from Muslims. And so what point I want to make is how we need to think from our positions about both the spectacular moments of violence and also the kind of everyday corrosive forms of hate. And so I'm bringing in here a very simple version of a kind of older countering violent extremism model, which is basically a concentric circle model. And so the goal in this is to move people out, one circle out, or ideally two circles out, so isolating the people in the center. So basically the idea is that everyone except the people in the center who are the hardcore people who will actually turn to violence, everyone else can be moved out and those people can be isolated. This works for Muslim extremists just as well as it does for anti-Muslim white supremacists. But the model is usually considered in isolation. And I think what we also need to think about is the ways in which hate supports other forms of hate. Extremists sometimes like to reference one another, and people who hate one kind of person tend to have an additive relationship with hate and tend to hate other groups as well. And so I'm thinking here partly of the very different responses from Al-Qaeda and ISIS to the Christchurch attacks, for example, with Al-Qaeda saying that avenging Muslim victims was great, attacking churches was not, and ISIS not saying that. And I'm also thinking of less spectacular, less organized, less extreme forms of hatred. So forms of suspicion and distance, as well as stereotyping. All of those processes also contribute to dehumanization if they don't directly result in the loss of human life. And I think pushing back at that level and recognizing the interconnections between forms of hate and expressions of hate is where we as scholars and teachers and members of various communities can have the most impact. Conventional understanding, of course, is that people in the innermost circles are the hardest to move. So we're going to kind of bracket them. But for those in the outer circles, some passive supporters and silent folk, I think we can point to, or I'd like to point to one kind of two-part approach, which I think you'll also see and hear more about today. So one approach is to provide facts in small doses and let them take effect over time. I think of these as fact worms, the equivalent of earworms, basically those annoying songs that get stuck in your head. They're known for being hard to get out even though you want them to, and they stay, and sometimes you even share them with others. I have similar goals with fact worms. I want to put out small bits of information that worm their ways into people's minds and start to unsettle long-held assumptions in ways that'll take shape months from now, a year from now. And for me, that's a lot of what I see in terms of the goals of teaching and public engagement. We provide students and community members with some material to chew on, and over time it starts to shift beliefs. I do want to note this is different from yelling at someone. I think there is a place for, I don't know, rage tweeting and rage texting. That's venting. That's not mind changing. So I'm advocating for more teaching and more effort at public engagement. What I also don't want to do is just recite facts and assume that data on its own is convincing. I'm a historian by training. I work in a religious studies department, so I come from two fields that really privilege evidence-based arguments. However, evidence isn't persuasive in many contexts on its own. We need to take what is behind assumptions seriously, a lot of which is fear, and that means working with narratives and emotions. And so I think the second part of this is that the key is to turn facts into narratives, to turn data into stories, and to bring in emotion and affect as reason's more powerful cousins. One other important concentric circle is that of influence. Who influences us and who do we influence? And this is also often depicted as one circle. While I think it should be kind of a whole ton of concentric circles continuously intersecting in different ways and continuously changing, just like relationships and contexts continuously change. But however the picture is drawn, we're somewhere in the concentric circles of many people, those of our students, those of our colleagues, our neighbors, our in-person and our online acquaintances. And so I think we would do well to consider these circles as strategic opportunities and also to consider the long-term cost of not doing so. Thank you.
Another great example on time. So next, Professor Kornfeld. Oops, and I didn't move that.
Sorry.
Hi, Moshe Kornfeld. I'm a scholar of American Jewish life. I'm going to share a few observations from that perspective this morning or afternoon. Mass shootings in America are quickly subsumed by political rather than pragmatic discourse. That said, after the Pittsburgh synagogue massacre this past October, I naively assumed that the type of anti-Semitism responsible for the shooting would become the primary focus of ensuing political discourse. After all, it is white nationalist men who are finding encouragement in murky corners of the internet and killing Jews at prey. As it turns out, the worst case of anti-Semitic violence in American history created a political opportunity to bring an ongoing discussion of anti-Semitism on the left to the center of American political discourse. In the 7 months following the Pittsburgh shooting, anti-Semitism has emerged as a political tool for sowing divisions in the fragile political alliances that collectively make up the Democratic Party. Take, for example, Linda Sarsour, an activist of Palestinian descent and one of the leaders of the Women's March, who has long been the target of conservative media. Like many American Muslim leaders, Sarsour attended and spoke at a vigil held in response to the Sabbath shooting. Sponsored by a progressive Jewish organization, the Sunday vigil was held in front of the White House. Official protest signs read, "Trump, your white nationalism kills." Additionally, Sarsour helped to organize Muslims Unite for Pittsburgh's Synagogue, a fundraising campaign that raised nearly $240,000 in support of the Pittsburgh shooting victims. Sarsour's efforts emphasized cross-cultural and interfaith political alliances as a way to combat Trumpism and resurgent white nationalism. While I don't agree with Sarsour on many issues, I laud her efforts to build alliances in the face of a resurgent populist right. On Monday, right after the shooting, the Daily Wire, a conservative website founded by Ben Shapiro, published an article entitled "Women's March Holds Vigil to Oppose Anti-Semitism," led by Linda Sarsour. The article, which falsely states that Sarsour led the rally, was an immediate example of a sustained post-Pittsburgh effort to question the legitimacy of Linda Sarsour in American political discourse. Critiques focused on her support of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, BDS, as well as connections between March leaders and Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan. While in the weeks prior to the Pittsburgh shooting, Sarsour was not a prominent focus in the news media, in the weeks and months that followed, she was the target of a sustained barrage of attacks against her and the other leaders of the Women's March. Attacking Sarsour at this moment was a way to thwart coalition building that might have occurred in response to the Pittsburgh massacre. In the Daily Wire article, the author calls attention to a tweet in which Sarsour connects anti-Semitism with all forms of xenophobia. Quote, "Notice they're conflating terms associating anti-Semitism with xenophobia in an effort to connect violence explicitly against the Jewish people with a broader campaign against opponents of unfettered immigration," end quote. These attacks achieved a significant measure of success. In the weeks and months that followed, leading figures publicly chastised the leadership of the Women's March, and various local chapters decided to disaffiliate with the national group. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that sexism, racism, and Islamophobia played a key role in shifting the national conversation from a white murderous man to activist women of color. This trend continued with very public debates about freshman Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and a series of recent statements in which President Trump characterized the Democratic Party itself as anti-Semitic. I conclude by mentioning a parallel moment in American Jewish history from the early 20th century. In 1913, in response to the conviction and subsequent lynching of Leo Frank, a Jewish factory manager in Georgia who was accused of raping and killing 13-year-old Mary Fagan, Jewish leaders concerned with anti-Semitism founded the Anti-Defamation League. The ADL's original mission was to, quote, stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment for all. The ADL continues to advocate for particular Jewish interests while, quote, fighting threats to our very democracy, including cyber hate, bullying, bias in schools and in the criminal justice system, terrorism, hate crimes, coercion of religious minorities, contempt for anyone who is different, end quote. Twinning the fight against anti-Semitism with efforts to combat all forms of hatred is, in fact, a central feature of the American Jewish experience. Abandoning this approach is, to use an old phrase, not good for the Jews, and it's not good for America.
All right. And Professor Pessin.
In the preface to his 1960s book, Totality and Infinity, French-Lithuanian Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas asks us to reflect not just on peace, but on the possibility or perhaps the impossibility of a kind of peace that is more than just, as he puts it, a peace between the wars. In some respect, Levinas, a Holocaust survivor who lost his family to Nazi atrocities, can be seen as crafting his entire philosophical edifice to allow for, if not the possibility of this peace itself, then at least the possibility of the hope for such a peace. And for Levinas, this hope is not light and not easy. On the contrary, it is a kind of difficult hope that we need to work for. Hope, for Levinas, signals not simply a thought or a dream. It is rather part of a sobering worldview in which, as a Holocaust survivor, Levinas demands that we rethink ethics, philosophy, theology, religion, and politics in terms of an infinite responsibility, beyond mere tolerance, respect, and beyond even friendship and love. A responsibility that calls us to hear the command, "Thou shalt not kill," issuing from your neighbor. Levinas asks us to live in a world in which we hear the command, "Thou shalt not kill," issuing out of every other human person with the intensity of a backdraft that knocks us out of our cruise control lives and calls us to respond with our entire bodies in and through a praxis of decisive deeds and actions aimed at protecting our neighbors and alleviating their suffering. And what is perhaps most arresting of all is that for Levinas, the source of this call to infinite responsibility, the source of this command not to kill, the source of this invocation to alleviate my neighbor's suffering, is precisely that about your neighbor which is different from you. Levinas is often misrepresented as saying that we are all humans, so we should love all humans. This is a misrepresentation in two ways. First, Levinas is calling for responsibility, not love. You are, we may say, responsible even for those you don't like or love. And while, yes, we are all humans, it is precisely for Levinas not this that is doing the commanding. The command to not kill for Levinas issues not from something about your neighbor that is just like you, for example, from the fact that you and she are both humans, rather in a deeply uncomfortable, risky demand. This Holocaust survivor is asking us to hear the call to responsibility for the other, precisely in that aspect of her that you do not share. The command to not kill issues not from the shared common humanity with me. The command to not kill issues from her otherness from me, from that about her that exceeds my understanding and is precisely not something that she and I have in common. Learning to love neighbors for what they have in common with ourselves is relatively easy when compared with Levinas's call to be responsible for neighbors precisely in virtue of what they do not have in common with ourselves. This, for Levinas, is the hard work of difficult hope. I share this as part of the panel today because when I read of anti-Muslim and other acts of sheer hate and violence, I find myself returning to the words of Levinas and working with my students to study his works and to try to devise ways to bring something of Levinas's invocation into our own socio-political structures. My current small way of thinking on this is to dedicate time to interfaith civics within a U.S. context, thinking at the theoretical and practical levels about how we face one another in greater spirits of responsibility and action, even just in this country. This includes my work with colleagues on campus towards religious inclusivity initiatives on campus, and an upcoming participation with the Interfaith Youth Corps, where I'll be developing a new undergraduate class on interfaith civics, including helping students interrogate the tensions between liberal emphases on individual autonomy, rights, and equality, and more holistic communal equity outcomes, including around race and religion. This is how I try to respond to hate.
Next is Professor Rhodes.
Thank you. What I want to do is just talk a little bit about the problem of hate crime from a political science perspective, which is where I come from in the Corbell School. I want to make a list of some of the things that we know about mass shootings, hate crimes from recent research, and how that should inform both the way that we think about it and the way that policymakers should act. So one thing is that it's become very clear that tackling the issue of hate crime from any one disciplinary perspective is bound to fail. So political scientists, for example, have spent a lot of time explaining the rise of nationalist politicians, including Donald Trump, using socioeconomic data, ascribing it to the people who are left behind by the economy and so on. When we actually know from other disciplines, political psychology in particular, that it's not socioeconomic conditioning that leads to racism and its expression in extreme forms. What we know from the work of political psychologists and other political scientists is that the real problem is the development of insider-outsider cultures. This is facilitated by the internet, where online groups engage in the expression of ideologies that create in-group sentiments versus outsiders of different cultures, of different colors, of different religious creeds. We know that those groups give permission to people such as the Christchurch killer, in the sense that it's the sound box echoing the same message over and over again will encourage certain people to take extreme actions. We know that mental illness has virtually nothing to do with any of the major perpetrators of these large-scale hate crimes. This was true of Anders Breivik, the far-right neo-Nazi Norwegian who killed dozens of young social democrats in Norway in 2011. It's true of the Christchurch shooter. What those people say is that they believe in an ideology that the rest of us find unacceptable, and to attribute that to mental illness as most American politicians do, for example, is a mistake. What else do we know about politicians and these groups? As Nader says, there was a big leap in racist attacks during the 2016 Trump campaign. But that's also true of other events where politicians casually link racist rhetoric to political issues. So the Brexit campaign in Britain led exactly to the same phenomenon. Leaps in attacks, racist attacks across the board, across the country at the time of the political campaign. And we know why this is. We know that the charlatan who today Donald Trump congratulated, the charlatan Nigel Farage, the far-right politician in Britain, who did extremely well in the European elections and was congratulated by Donald Trump today. We know that his campaign was based on racism and the artificial linkage between the issues of European Union membership and a purported flood of ISIS and other jihadists into the UK at the European Union's behest. These kinds of casual linkages are more than just casual, in fact, they're intentional. They create the kind of sentiment that politicians like Nigel Farage in Britain and Donald Trump in the United States can benefit from. How do we deal with that? What else do we know? We have seen two kinds of responses to the more extreme forms of hate crime, such as the mass shootings. One is, and which seems to be a relatively good one, was the one that was embraced by the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, after that attempt, which was basically to suppress all information of the killer, his identity, his name, his ideology, just to simply suffocate, or rather deprive those people of the oxygen of publicity that they would otherwise be getting. What's interesting is the extent to which in other countries, especially in the UK, tabloids such as the Daily Mail and the Sun newspaper, the Murdoch newspaper, exploited the available information to put that stuff online, which led to a 600% increase in Islamophobic incidents in the UK after the Christchurch terror attack, many of which explicitly referenced the Christchurch attack to validate their attacks on Muslims. So one way of dealing with this problem is to try and deprive these extreme racist criminals from having any publicity. And there's a big campaign in the United States called the No Notoriety Group, which campaigns for the media to do just that. The other approach, which applies to less dramatic criminal behavior, is the one that's been embraced by the European Union, which is the opposite in a sense, which is to publicize microaggressions, small-scale attacks, in order to bring to the public's attention how numerous and how important these things are. The European approach, involving the European Agency for Fundamental Rights, is precisely to collect more and more data on anti-Semitism and other forms of racism and to publicize it. So the general message seems to be, in policy terms, suppress the actors in terms of giving information or allowing them to become notorious within those particular racist in-groups, but to publicize how important this criminal activity actually is. Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Silver.
I'd like to briefly discuss the connection among hateful speech, freedom of expression, and acts of violence based on hate. Specifically today, I'd like to share with you what I frequently talk to my students about when we bring up the topic of how much tolerance should we have for intolerance. I have to admit that these difficult discussions are taking place more and more frequently the longer I've been teaching at DU. The conversations frequently begin with calls to ban so-called quote-unquote hate speech. It's completely natural and understandable and reasonable that caring individuals might believe that it is we should not tolerate hate speech. But I typically suggest to my students that while it is completely understandable to want to do this, it is very important we resist this temptation. I always stress to my students that my point is not that hate speech is harmless. Indeed, it is not. Words can cause harm. There has been a lot of rhetoric the last few years that college students should just toughen up. I disagree. My students are intelligent, strong, and committed to discussing difficult concepts in intelligent and emotional ways. But what I point out to my students is that words are powerful. In some situations, the words we use themselves can cause emotional or mental harm or inflict deep psychological pain. However, we shouldn't confuse these situations with violence and speech that incites violence against others. But as I've explained towards the end of my comments, we already have laws that allow us to punish expression that crosses from ideas to action. So why should we resist the temptation to create new laws censoring hate speech? First, there is no single definition of hate speech. The law does not recognize a special category of speech called hate speech, and I would suggest there is no good definition of hate speech. In popular discourse, it is used to loosely demonize a wide array of speech. It is generally thought to mean speech that expresses hatred or discriminatory views about certain groups that have historically been subjected to discrimination. But these definitions are frequently extremely narrow, internally inconsistent, incoherent, and extremely vague. Typically, they only focus on a very narrow category of speech and leave all other categories of individuals completely unprotected. Second, in situations where hate speech laws or codes have gone into effect, they are almost always used against the minority they were designed to protect. Censorship laws are almost always used by those in power to persecute the ideas of minority groups that they find unacceptable. In addition, claims that something is hate speech have frequently been used to stifle legitimate protest and robust discussions of matter of public debate. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement has frequently been accused of engaging in hate speech against members of law enforcement. Third, laws against hate speech rarely, if ever, deal with the underlying hatred they are designed to address. Forcing the bigot to stay quiet doesn't make him stop being a bigot. In addition, by forcing the bigot to be quiet, we do not admit the underlying problems of our society and what some individuals or groups are forced to experience on a daily basis. It allows the rest of us to hide our heads in the sand and say that we are doing something. So, what do I say to my students when they ask me what our response should be when we hear hateful things? We must speak out against hatred, and we must give our students the courage and the tools to do the same. By engaging in counter-speech, we can support the individual or groups under attack, demonstrate our opposition to the hateful ideas being expressed, and come together as a community to support each other. By counter-speech, I mean speech that responds to hate speech with a message that clearly and forcefully rejects the hate. Counter-speech should and could include refutations of the original message, support for the individuals who are attacked, and information that seeks to alter the views of the original speaker and convince other speakers of the fallacy of the original speaker's ideas. This was a key component of our own campus speech code. We passed a speech code in the last year that says when our community is subjected to attack, the university has a duty to speak out against such attacks. This doesn't mean we are unable to punish individuals whose speech does more than simply convey a hateful idea. There are 3 categories of speech that are well defined and can be prohibited without raising concerns related to freedom of expression. But I would suggest to you that it's important that we focus on these 3 categories of speech rather than the nebulous and vague term hate speech. It is also important to remember that I am not suggesting there is a list of bad words we should not be allowed to say. As anyone who has ever played golf knows, fuck does not always mean intercourse. First, we should prevent speech that amounts to a true threat or any statement where the speaker means to communicate a serious expression of an intent to commit an act of unlawful violence. We should prohibit fighting words, which are words by their very utterance tend to cause a breach of the peace. And we should prevent any speech that is designed and is likely to incite or produce eminent lawless action. These are 3 categories of speech that have long been recognized to be outside of First Amendment protection. I'd like to conclude with one of my favorite quotes from the Chief Justice John Roberts that I share with my students every quarter that I teach. Speech is powerful. It can stir people to action, move them to tears of both joy and sorrow, and, as it did here, inflict great pain. We cannot react to that pain by punishing the speaker. As a nation, we have chosen a different course, to protect even hurtful speech on public issues to ensure that we do not stifle robust public debate. Thank you.
And Professor Stidley.
So I was hoping to outline an empirical link today to the status between, I'm going to talk about hate crimes. So the status of hate crimes and how recent trends might guide responses for our discussion today. And I also thought it'd be helpful to illustrate that despite the recent events that have brought us here today, which are certainly concerning, we can still see that progress is being made and what efforts we should do to continue to keep that progress moving. Federal Bureau of Investigation collects data. I'm a criminologist, so I went straight to my tried and true statistics. The FBI collects data on the occurrence of hate crimes in the United States using the Uniform Crime Reports program. And this gives us a starting point to empirically assess hate and its connection to violence, since a hate crime is defined as, quote, a criminal offense which is motivated in whole or in part by the offender's biases against a race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity, end quote. To be clear, a hate crime is not a category like murder or arson, but a label that can be applied to all crimes as long as the bias appears as a motivator. This slide shows that the total number of hate crimes, the total number of hate crimes and the rate of crimes per 100,000 people in the U.S. That have been reported to the FBI from 1996 to 2017 is declining, or has been declining since the mid-90s. So overall, the picture is more heartening than not. We can see that there was a spike in 2001, right around the 9/11 attacks, which corresponds with the spike in hate crimes that occurred against Muslims in the U.S. That's concerning, and hate crimes continue to decline after that spike until about 2014, when again another concern emerges with a recent rise in hate crimes. So on the whole, the prevalence of hate crimes, though, is lower than it was 20 years ago. The uptick that has happened since 2014 is a concern, but the question I think should be for us, why is this new increase happening? Criminologists will likely spend the next 5 to 20 years diving into it, but we can hazard two guesses from where we stand today. The first is that hate crimes may actually be rising, or two, the rate of hate crimes has actually stayed the same, but the rate at which it's reported to police has increased. Since these crimes are reported to the police, crimes that don't go, this graph represents crimes that are reported to the police. If it is not reported to the police, it does not get reported in the FBI statistics. The FBI recently, though, has conducted surveys using the National Criminal Victimization Survey, asking people what types of crimes they have experienced that may not have been reported to the police. The number of people who have reported that they have experienced a hate crime has not significantly changed in recent years, but the number of people who have said that they have experienced a hate crime and have decided to report that to the police has increased. Likewise, research by sociologists finds that civil activism is an influential predictor of police reporting for hate crimes, meaning that activism from nonprofit groups, civil rights organizations, and efforts to increase social awareness among the general public prompts law enforcement to take the issue of hate crime seriously. An increase in public awareness to reach out to police is a positive change, because we know that police departments also change their policing practices based on whether local populations perceive hate crimes to be legitimate issues of concern. Supporting this interpretation is the fact that when we look at the makeup of hate crimes reported to the police in this slide, we don't see a noticeable jump in any one type of hate crime, suggesting that the spike in hate crimes that has occurred since 2014 is not due to any one type of bias, but perhaps due to increased reporting for all types of hate crimes. Public responses denouncing hate and increasing public awareness of how hate manifests itself in society have arguably contributed to the long-term decline in hate crimes, which is positive. In the long run, the answer for us may be that awareness works, activism works, and statistics work. Events like this one today may lack a sense of immediacy and feel meager in the face of extreme violence, but these efforts can explain why these crimes seem to be both increasing in the short term, but declining overall. Overall, I believe that is a positive sign of progress. We should keep seeking what works and remain resilient in the face of extreme violence. Progress is slow, and it often covers its tracks. But recent years are better than we were 20 years ago, and we should continue down this path of progress.
And Professor Wadsworth. We sit today on lands well known to indigenous nations for millennia, but which, for centuries preceding Western colonization, were the ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples. I'm grateful for the relationships we are slowly building with these resilient living communities, now based in Oklahoma, Wyoming, and Montana. I offer this acknowledgement not as an empty formality. As the chair of the faculty committee that in 2014 reported on the role of DU's founder in the Sand Creek Massacre,
I want to suggest some ways in which the history of this very institution pertains to the questions of this symposium. Focusing on us before them can be illuminating. The Colorado Seminary was founded almost 155 years ago, conceived as a pioneering institution of civilization among an unruly population of miners, speculators, and settlers staking their claims in the Colorado Territory. The seminary's founding father was then territorial governor and superintendent of Indian Affairs, Dr. John Evans. Fellow Methodist governor and fellow Methodist and Civil War Colonel John Chivington also served on his chartering body. Technically, though, in 1864, all white settlers were illegal squatters on Cheyenne and Arapaho land. 2 weeks after the seminary opened its doors, Chivington, in a hastily appointed role as a commander of 2 federalized Colorado Volunteers regiments that Governor Evans had secured to kill so-called hostile Indians, led a surprise attack on peace-seeking Cheyenne and Arapaho bands camped beneath the American flag. Those bands, whom Evans had denied a peace agreement, had been promised temporary protection by military authorities at Fort Lyons at the edge of a small slice of land designated as their future reservation until further notice. What would come to be known as the Sand Creek Massacre was a ruthless winter attack on starving, demoralized people, mostly women, children, and elderly men, and involving mass atrocities considered outside the bounds of modern warfare even then. Over 200 people were slaughtered. Soldiers cut babies out of mothers, severed genitalia, scalped people alive, and brought such gruesome souvenirs back to Denver to parade as public trophies on Larimer Street. Thanks to detailed accounts sent to Congress from 2 dissenting soldiers, Sand Creek became the Abu Ghraib of its time, a national scandal leading to 3 federal investigations and the loss of Evans's governorship and political career, though not a single military conviction. Evans denied direct involvement to his dying day, but with 20 years in hindsight on the massacre, he commented to historian H.H. Bancroft that the benefit to Colorado was very great, quote, "for it relieved us very much of the roaming tribes of Indians," unquote. Native Americans remember the Sand Creek Massacre as another instance of the terror Native people routinely endured on their own lands, just the only instance that the U.S. formally recognizes as an unjust massacre, not a battle. As members of the DU community, we are expected to be proud pioneers. For now, our administration and board of trustees do not wish to revisit the darker connotations of this word. Today in the U.S., we have a president who cites Andrew Jackson as his role model and regularly tweets anti-Native sneers against one of his political adversaries while defending the prerogatives of white Western civilization. Trump and his supporters are well aware that systematic violence has always been at the heart of Manifest Destiny. Why did I go there? 4 points to connect the dots. 1, we must keep in mind that the recent waves of extremist violence resurfacing across the European diaspora are fueled by centuries-old ideologies at its center and reflect entitlements long granted those white, putatively Christian, propertied, male, who've been figured as central and superior within that culture. Today's hate mongers channel subterranean resentments that have been simmering for decades among those who don't want such entitlements challenged. 2, virulent xenophobia and mainstream patriotism are both underwritten by pathologies of memory, habits of forgetting or actively disavowing the violence that has propelled Western empire and anchored settler colonial societies. Our academic disciplines, including political science, have been more often accomplices than resistors to pathological memory. The flip side of collective denial is a treacly nostalgia, a fantasy of recovering a false past that was well-ordered and free from uncomfortable difference, #MAGA. 3, failing to properly remember and identify the violences wrought by empire and colonialism enables the current wave of extremism, which depends on people overlooking the pathways between the violence of past entitlements and current identity attachments. As we fight the spread of hatred, we must work not only to understand, but also to interrupt the routine forgetting or minimizing of foundational violence that liberal citizens are expected to perpetuate. Our history bleeds into our present. 4, educators who cover our own society's traditions of violence and injustice are now accused of politicizing the classroom, and there are organizations on campus right now working to bring us down for doing so. We must have the courage to continue anyway. We cannot analyze or contest hatred without first understanding how we may have benefited from it and at what cost.
Professor Maleno?
So earlier this week, at the end of the year history department picnic, our graduating seniors unexpectedly presented the faculty with a series of comedic mock awards. Things like most likely to know more about your topic than you do, or most likely to return your email at 3 in the morning. Why do I bring this up today? Because my award was most likely to be put on a government watch list because of his research. If many of my colleagues here receive this award, it might be funny, but not particularly out of the ordinary. In my case, however, this award is a shocking sign of the times. Shocking because I'm a medieval historian. My primary research field focuses on trade and diplomacy between the Carolingian Empire, a group that many of you have probably never heard of, and Scandinavians, who we sometimes call Vikings, around the year 800, so some 1,200 plus years ago. This is not precisely the sort of thing we would assume the FBI is keeping a close watch on. And yet here we are. As I prepared for today's panel, one of the first things I had to do was spend some time reading the manifesto of the person responsible for the Christchurch massacre. I actually did so at the courthouse because I was waiting for jury duty. So watch list territory, I suppose. On the front of this document, and again on the back, is a symbol that I have become all too familiar with over the last several years. It's called the Sonnenrad, or the Black Sun. And so on the right side is a 7th century Alemannic, a Germanic tribe decorative disc found in a grave. And on the other side is the front image of the Christchurch Manifesto. And you can see the Sonnenrad, which was adopted by first the Nazis and then has become a prevalent symbol of white supremacists. This symbol is one of many medieval icons that have found a new life as slogans, signs, and shorthand for any number of white nationalist groups. The Anti-Defamation League has an entire online dictionary dedicated to hate symbols. Of these 179 featured images, nearly 20% have some connection to medieval history. Of that 20%, over half are associated with Vikings. Many of these symbols were on display at the Charlottesville rally in 2017, and a year earlier, on November 4th, 2016, just a few days before the presidential election, the National Socialist Movement, the largest neo-Nazi organization in America, announced that it was officially changing its symbol from a swastika to a Viking rune. And I'll quote from the announcement on their webpage. Quote, "Our time to rise is now, and for us to effectively do that and reach the masses, we are doing a slight rebranding. The National Socialist Movement will be ceasing public use of the swastika effective November 5th, 2016. Our flags and banners now bear the Odell rune, and our patches will soon follow suit. The masses believe exactly as we do, but have steered clear of us due to our use of the swastika. Your party platform remains the same. Your party remains unchanged. It is a cosmetic overhaul only," end quote. So here we can see the original National Socialist Movement flag on the right, and then the rebranded cosmetic overhaul featuring Scandinavian Othel rune, or Othala rune. So why Vikings? Who is this actually designed to appeal to? What are the masses that this piece of rhetoric is thinking about? The very last line of the Christchurch Manifesto explicitly references the glories of Valhalla. The goal is to appeal first and foremost to young white men. Young white men who think that Vikings and medieval history are cool. Young white men who spend their time on the internet simultaneously debating whether the sandals worn in episode 3 of the TV show Vikings are authentic, and spreading memes about Knight Templars and Viking berserkers. Medievalists, academics of all sorts, but medievalists in particular, need to reckon with the fact that the field they love is also beloved of a very different group of people, ones who have the potential to be radicalized and to turn the distant medieval past into a very dark present. What do we do about this is an open question, but we cannot just dismiss them as non-experts. Any post on Viking history on Reddit will have an infinite number of hits over any academic article. So do we engage in public history? Do we dive into internet forums and make our own memes? Whatever we do, it can't be nothing. It's not likely to be a simple answer, but I'm hoping that today, talking to people whose fields are by necessity related to the contemporary world and not by some sort of horrible fluke accident, we can maybe find some answers. Thank you.
It's amazing what you're staying on time so well. Professor Leahy from Spanish.
As organizer, I hope maybe Lisa can be clement. I might go over by a minute or a couple 30 seconds maybe, but I'll try my best. What I'm projecting here is a sobering, incomplete list of recent acts of violence for which I did not propose roundtables. Why Christchurch then? And why not any of these? And this is selective. What follows are personal reflections on some challenges these questions pose relating to positionality and privilege in the context of ethically minded academic labor. My immediate answer to why Christchurch is disciplinary, two names central to medieval and early modern Spanish studies, my field, Pelayo and Lepanto, were ascribed on the killer's weapons, along with a mishmash of other intentionally provocative references to Christian holy war and crusade. Pelayo, for context, is a foundational figure in a Spanish national mythology known as Reconquista, according to which the 8th century Muslim invasion of Iberia was resisted by an heroic remnant of Roman Catholic Visigoths, from whom descend the essentialized Spanish people that would eventually eradicate Islam and Judaism from Iberia by means of sacred violence, the machinery of the Inquisition, and ultimately expulsion, first of Spain's Jews in 1492, and then of Spain's Muslim-descended Moriscos in 1609 to 1614. Pelayo is a signifier of that heavily mythologized process of ethno-racial and religious cleansing. Lepanto plays similarly, but in a more global key. The name refers to a 1571 naval battle between the Ottoman fleet and a Holy League in which Spain played a major role. Lepanto materializes Spain's destiny as bulwark against global Islam in the Mediterranean and Christian Europe. In a move all too familiar to medievalists, as we've just seen with Daniel's talk, at Christchurch, history is weaponized through these and other figures to justify slaughter in the name of imagined supremacy. So, why Christchurch? This attack was uncommonly legible from within my discipline, that's an answer. I felt implicated. This is what I study and teach, and here are Pelayo and Lepanto being used to actually kill people. For some reason, this felt to me more consequential than the tired regurgitation of these narratives by Spain's resurgent nationalist Vox party, and more visceral than seeing Jerusalem crosses, which I also study, on display at Charlottesville. This is just an example. Given the choice between silent neutrality and resistance, there's really only one ethical option, as Simon Doubleday and Dorothy Kim and many others so argued. So I floated this panel as an expression of engaged resistance. The answer, this is a serviceable answer, I think, but it sidesteps tougher questions. Like, what should I make of my literal years of inaction in the face of no less atrocious violence before? And what might my sudden response to Christchurch now say about the ethics of academic labor more broadly? To begin with, as a white, straight, cis male Hispanist, before confronting hate, I think I need to confront first the structures and experiences of privilege that made this sudden turn easy. Privilege implies, inter alia, a kind of freedom of choice that licenses possibilities, and those possibilities include options like pursuing public scholarship or doing nothing. I may have been saddened, outraged, or appalled personally at other moments before, but I never pushed for roundtables for Michael Brown or the Pulse nightclub or the Tree of Life synagogue. If we want to contest hate and we abhor the taking of life, we need to be conscious about what we make an effort to actually care about and act on, and we have to think about why. On the flip side, there are problems inherent in the very choice to act at all that I'd like to at least acknowledge. Jenny Tan's critique of, quote, white progressive self-importance that's really more about self-promotion than social or political principle is essential. And this is a logic that can apply equally to individuals and to institutions, I think. As Sierra Lemuto has noted, action that serves to vapidly just signal virtue recenters whiteness in the very act of pretending to critique it. On both sides, institutional whiteness and its attendant privilege seriously complicate ethical work. The work of contesting hate thus has to happen in tandem with the work of contesting privilege, We have to be self-aware and honest, and both modes of consultation have to go hand in hand. There's also a separate disciplinary quandary here to acknowledge. Christchurch was legible from within my field. Nauseated by what I saw, I proposed this panel. But surely I shouldn't need guns scrawled with Pelayo in order to move from sidelined hand-wringing to direct action. One challenge, though, is that for those of us in less transparently relevant fields, the very choice to engage ethically demands that we rethink what relevance is. What can someone working on pre-1700 Iberia really say meaningful about problems like racial bias in policing or online extremism or white supremacy in the United States? Don't those problems belong to other fields? Questions like this are challenging, but the challenge doesn't excuse us. If we want to be effective allies, we need to aggressively coax our work in the direction of ever broader contemporary engagement. And a piece of that effort, I think, also is that we need to coax skeptical colleagues toward embracing this kind of work too. It may be helpful to think here about focusing our energies not on directly battling the seething lunacy of violent bigots festering away in the dark reaches of the internet, but rather on changing the minds of reluctant colleagues, not to mention our students, who are not yet on board with this effort. My point in concluding is that our subject positions as students, teachers, researchers, or like just as human people matter very much, but the powerful limits imposed by those positions do not constitute legitimate excuses for inaction. We live here and we live now, and we all need to be finding ways to push harder on ourselves and on each other and on our material to speak to this moment.
And Professor Ellard?
I thought I'd approach the topic of this roundtable by using an example from the long lens of early medieval history. And hopefully this will be an apt corollary to what Daniel and Chad just said. It's an example that's not about hate per se, but about willful misunderstandings within the medieval Anglosphere that function, I think, is very powerful and yet very simple preconditions to hate. In the mid-19th century, the Duke of Blacas, a member of French high nobility and an antiquarian collector, purchased this coin while on a trip to Rome. Upon his death in 1867, it was sold by the Duke's heirs and eventually ended up at the British Museum. This is called office dinar. It's a gold coin that appears to have Arabic inscriptions engraved on both sides with Offa Rex in Latin on the obverse. Offa's dinar was struck sometime between 773 and 775 AD for King Offa of Mercia, one of the most powerful rulers in Britain. Offa was very interested in claiming economic power through the royal oversight of international trade, and he was keen to harness the ideological apparatus offered by Christianity and the church. The story of Offa's gold dinar doesn't begin, however, with Offa or his kingdom in Britain, which was quite sizable. It begins, rather, with the Abbasid Caliphate, which in the 8th century produced a unit of currency called a dinar that has the Shahada, or Islamic creed, struck on both sides. Oops, sorry. Okay. Using gold from North African mines, these coins circulated across the caliphate, which stretched in the mid-8th century from modern-day Libya to Iran. And they functioned as standard currency for Mediterranean trade. In addition, the dinar began to appear in the abbeys of gold-impoverished Europe. From central Italy to France and Belgium, written records tell us that from around 770 AD until about 850 AD, the dinar was encountered and discussed across Europe on account of its function, one, as the dominant coinage in the Mediterranean region, two, and a golden currency. Offa's dinar, however, is not one of these Abyssinian coins. It's an imitation. Using a real dinar as an exemplar, the Mercian goldsmith who struck this coin not only got part of the lettering wrong, so you can see, so la, which is a particle that negates, is just reduced to x's in Offa's dinar. But he also, and also wahda, which is only or alone here, is also completely misconstrued as some, it just doesn't even, it's just symbols. So not only did he get the lettering wrong, but he also wrote Afa, the word Afa, and I'll say it here, with the Arabic upside down, and literally within a lettering that should be Allah. To add another ripple to the story of this coin, some scholars believe that Afa's fake dinar was a gift to Pope Adrian as part of Afa's promise to deliver an annual donation of 365 mancuzes, or gold coins, to the papal see in Rome. It's a coin that's not meant for circulation, but as tribute. So many things are wrong with Afa's dinar. Afa displays his political religious allegiance to the church on a coin stamped with the Shahada. Afa, a Christian temporal ruler, has his name engraved between the calligraphic spaces of an upside-down Allah. Such willful ignorance of Arabic language and Islamic religious culture is the price Afa is willing to pay in order to advertise himself aspirationally as a ruler of economic prosperity and international trade in his tiny corner of Northern Europe. And he does this via a non-circulating, quote, dinar that imitates the ever-circulating currency of the Abbasid Caliphate, the real economic heavyweights of the Mediterranean and beyond. One can only wonder what Pope Adrian thought of the gift. Afa's dinar is an act of bad faith that doesn't show hate or malice necessarily in action, but displays some very important preconditions for them, I think. One is that Afa fails to engage in another's language. He sees Arabic just as a series of decorative lines that can be unthinkingly imitated and manipulated for self-serving purposes. Succeeding from this place of linguistic disengagement and provincial monolingualism, Afa stamps his name in a place on the coin that broadcasts a message of religious and cultural insensitivity. That Afa members of his court and the goldsmith responsible for engraving Afa's dinar can make these mistakes results from the fact that the real dinar that served as Afa's exemplar probably found its way to Britain absent a merchant or trader from the caliphate. In Mercia, a dinar is just money, it's just an economic signifier. When accompanied by the presence of someone, a person, unaccompanied by the presence of someone, a person who speaks Arabic and practices Islam. Hate begins in a lot of places, but one of them is linguistic ignorance and misunderstanding. To not know or to be disinterested in communicating with another has the cascade effect of misreading cultural signs, religious values, and the human face that accompanies them. Hate also begins in the long history of such ignorance and misunderstanding, and one of the things I try and teach my students when I show them Afa's dinar is that the world, even during the Middle Ages, has always been global, that Muslim, Christian, and we should add Jewish relations don't begin with the Crusades, and that Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate were well-known entities across Europe and, quote, worth imitating, even if such imitation was fraught with mistake. From my disciplinary corner, I try to cultivate within my students a multilingual medieval world that makes them open to learning other languages and listening to the culture and religious practices that attend them. Sorry.
Everyone is fighting their occupational hazard of being able to speak for, at DU, 110 minutes. Yeah. So Professor Throop, who's a guest to DU, everyone else has been a DU professor. She is a guest, and she is speaking today with a full-length lecture at 4 p.m.
Thank you, and I want to start by thanking Dr. Leahy and the University of Denver community for including me in this discussion. I feel honored to be able to contribute and learn from this. Dr. Leahy has asked us, what can we or should we do from our particular disciplinary, institutional, and personal positions? My response to this question today is informed by my work as a historian, specifically of the European Middle Ages, and as a scholar of Christian religious violence, specifically the wars and violence known as the Crusades. White supremacists are using crusading ideas and imagery to promote their agenda and justify their violence. They're using the Crusades to do this work because the Crusades seem to offer a historical example of righteous white Christians fighting an existential threat posed by brown and black non-Christians. I'm sure it won't surprise anyone that many scholars of the crusading movement perceive a much more complicated history, and I actually don't want to dwell on that point today, because I think that correcting historical knowledge is insufficient on its own. The problem we face is ethical, not epistemological. To that end, I'd like to suggest we acknowledge 3 points and consider 2 steps for the future. Our first acknowledgement. Let's acknowledge that the use of crusading ideas and imagery by white supremacists is completely unsurprising. Crusade studies, and medieval studies for that matter, emerged in the context of 18th and 19th century Western colonial and imperial projects which were framed in terms of white Christian supremacy. Furthermore, crusading in the Middle Ages always involved colonization and Christian expansion. Of course, white supremacists are using the history of the Crusades. Our second acknowledgement. Let's acknowledge that this is not a simple question of a wrong version of history that can be effectively fought or can be only fought with a right version of history. Setting aside the idea that the academic discipline of history is somehow inevitably a force for good, if we argue about historical facts rather than ethics, we may seem to affirm that the issues at stake are epistemological instead of ethical, that if the history was right, the actions would be right, or at least would be better. Often, too, when we debate historical facts, we wind up performing a model of academic expertise that is itself grounded in the white patriarchal foundation of Western academia. 2 steps we might consider. First, those of us engaged in the historical profession can effectively consider the ethical dimensions of our work as scholars and teachers and make changes in that work accordingly, as Geraldine Heng, Dorothy Kim, Gabrielle Spiegel, and many others have already called upon us to do. Doing this includes acknowledging the limits of historicism. The philosopher of history Maria Inez Mudrovchik has noted that when facing an ethical crisis in the present, most historians' knee-jerk reaction is to give a narrative of how that crisis came about. But creating a narrative like this creates the sense that the present is inevitable, stable, and unavoidable. This has the potential to legitimize continuity over time as a foundation for ethical action, and continuity over time is no such thing. Second, as many others have suggested today, let's act in ways that recognize the broader picture and the broader problem. White supremacy is a real threat, but white supremacy is not exterior to ourselves, our communities, and our institutions, even when we are trying to counter it, and even though it doesn't always manifest as murder. If we are raising our voices about white supremacist murders or white supremacist use of our fields of study, but not all the other ways that racism manifests in our communities, government, and society, the many ways that racism negatively affects and has negatively affected our colleagues, students, and neighbors on a daily basis for centuries, then we are failing in our responsibilities not only as historians, but as human beings. Thank you.